The story of that night, as it gradually drifted to the rest of the crescent, was that on hearing Emily, Margaret had called out, and that Emily had replied that she was going downstairs to get an apple. As Emily, when unable to sleep, often went downstairs at night for something to eat, this had not surprised her. Save for one thing, and that was the alarm which had driven her out the night before. She had thought it odd for Emily to be prowling about after that experience, and her first inclination had been to offer to go with her. She was very tired, however, and Emily knew her way about. She was not surprised that she wanted food. She had eaten almost nothing since the Thursday before. But she was sorry now, tragically sorry. She had simply gone to sleep again and let her go alone. The evening, she said, had been quiet. Emily had slept most of the day, although late in the afternoon she had wakened and had agreed to see Lydia Talbot, who had been downstairs. Lydia had suggested nailing shut the two windows opening from Emily's room onto the porch roof, and she and Ellen had done it together. The two women, Emily and Lydia, had talked for some time. Although aunt and niece, there was no great disparity in their ages, and Emily had never had Margaret's dislike of the older woman. But after Miss Lydia's departure, Emily had been restless. She had got up and prowled around the house, especially on the second floor. When Margaret found her, she said she was looking for her bird, which Lydia had missed, and Margaret had had to tell her that the bird was dead. Emily had taken the news very hard, but had become more quiet as the day wore on. She, Margaret, and Mr. Lancaster had spent the evening downstairs. Mr. Lewis had brought out a copy of her mother's will, and had gone at 9 o'clock. After that, the two of them had sat in the library discussing it. Like every other value, Mrs. Lancaster's estate had shrunk greatly during the Depression. She had, however, left some $300,000, including the money in the chest, and $50,000 of this was left without restriction to Jim Wellington. It was an old will made when the estate had been valued at more than $1 million. Now that legacy to Jim loomed large and formidable, and Mr. Lancaster had seemed undisturbed. He had gone up to bed at 11, although she herself had remained below until almost midnight. Since her mother's death, her stepfather had refused to enter her mother's room, and had in fact locked it off from his own by the connecting bathroom. When he was ready for bed, therefore, he called down to her that it looked as though it might rain that night, and for her to close her mother's windows. She had unlocked the door, gone in and closed them. Emily was still awake and still worrying about her bird, for she opened her door when she heard Margaret and asked where the cage was. Margaret told her that George Talbot had taken it to the stable, and Emily had seemed satisfied. That was all she knew, and examination of Emily's room supported this part of her story. The book Emily had been reading was face down on the table beside her chair, and her bed jacket lay across the foot of the bed. What the police could not understand, nor those of us who learned it by the grapevine, was why Miss Emily should have at least partially redressed herself later, have put on her shoes and stockings and her petticoat, in order to do what she had done so many nights before, to go downstairs for something to eat. Miss Margaret, distracted as she was by her father's grave illness, could give no explanation. She never bothered to dress, was what she said. She often went in her nightdress and slippers, or sometimes in a wrapper. No, I can't understand it. The bird cage? But why in the world would she want it? She knew the bird was dead. That was the way the case stood until 3 o'clock that afternoon. Then the police, still searching for the empty shell, found two things which only added to our mystery. One of these was a garden spade, identified by Eben as belonging to the Daltons and left by him on Saturday leaning against the wall of the Dalton garage. This spade was discovered in the shrubbery near the body, but at first seemed to have no significance. It was Eben's identification which set them to thinking. The other was the discovery late that afternoon of the bullet itself, deeply implanted in a small tree in no man's land. There was no empty shell to be found, however, and no spot could be found where, if Miss Emily had indeed carried the spade to where it lay, she had used it for any purpose whatever. Inspector Briggs summed it up later. Well, there we were again, with the newspapers howling like nobody's business and the commissioner and the district attorney carrying on like two lunatics. What had we? She didn't shoot herself, that's certain. And we couldn't get a search warrant and tear all 5 houses wide open to look for a gun. Not the Crescent. There would have been hell to pay. All that bullet did until we'd examined it the next day was to show us approximately where she'd been shot from, the direction. That pointed to the walk itself, or to the space between those two houses. But we couldn't find the shell to prove it. What we figured was that she'd been shot from close range. It was a dark night, remember, no moon. Not exactly point blank, but close enough. And that she was out on some business of her own, maybe the gold. She'd carried that spade.